Tashi Delay, and welcome to Tibet Talks. I'm Ashwin Verghese, Communications Officer of the International Campaign for Tibet, and it's my pleasure to be your host this afternoon. With our world facing historic crises, we at ICT want to help spread the wisdom of Tibetan culture, as well as the teachings of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. In this series, you'll hear live conversations about Tibet with inspiring thinkers, leaders, activists, and artists. On today's show, we have a fantastic guest who will discuss the importance and the challenges of researching in Tibet for one of the world's leading human rights organizations. We'll also be joined by two very impressive young people who are future leaders of the Tibetan American community. We'll start the conversation in just a moment, but first, one housekeeping note for our audience. If you're watching this live and would like to ask questions for our guests, please email your questions to comments@savetibet.org or post your questions in the comments section of the live stream on our Facebook page. We look forward to hearing from you. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event. He is the Vice President of the International Campaign for Tibet, as well as a former member of the Central Tibetan Administration. So please join me as I welcome Buchung Sering. Buchung, thanks for being here at Tashi Delay.
Tashi Delay, thank you so much for this introduction. And welcome again, everybody, to this talk on Tibet, this time on an issue of research, which is something that's very personal to all people working on Tibet, as well as to those who are worried about the situation in Tibet and want to do something. So we have as our guest speaker for today is Sophie Richardson. Those of you who work in the human rights field would need no introduction. But Sophie is currently the China Director for Human Rights Watch. She graduated from UVA and Hopkins Nanjing program. She studied in Oberlin, and she has written several reports relating to human rights, political reform, other aspects of the issues, not just on China or Tibet, but also on certain other countries like Cambodia, Indonesia, etc. Sophie has been a steadfast friend of the Tibetan people, and we're very privileged to have you here today. The reason why research is important to us, and it's personal to me, at least in one sense, is because those of us who work on Tibet, we need to have a foundation, a basis by which we need to take up the issue. Like if you compare it to goods, you have to sell this good in the marketplace, and to sell the good, you need a way to find out what it is, how it is made, and who made it, and what sort of material it is, etc. The Tibetan people and those in the Tibet movement, particularly the Tibetan Americans, who are our target audience in one sense here, we have come up in a cultural surrounding where it was less important what happened to you, and it's more important what you can do to others. So, for example, if you may have spoken to Tibetan human rights defenders who very much don't want to talk about themselves or their own suffering, but are talking in general terms about what it means for the community and the culture. But these don't work in this modern world, particularly in the system, the policy-making system, where you need facts, you need materials, you need concepts, etc., which we are not used to. So therefore, research plays an important role in this. So what will happen is we would like you, Sophie, to begin with an initial remark on this, and then we'll be joined by my two fellow Tibetan Americans, Rinzin Sonam and Tashi Chogyal. Rinzin Sonam is a Tibetan American woman who was born in Tibet, was studied briefly in India before settling here in the United States. She is a graduate from St. Lawrence up in upstate New York, and now is serving as an intern in a non-profit organization up there that works on refugees. Tashi Chogyal is from the West Coast. He, I think, was born in the United States, so both of them bring different backgrounds to it. And Tashi Chogyal is currently doing a master's program at Tufts. And he, prior to that, he has also served in the federal government. These are two individuals who come from different backgrounds, and all three of us, as well as all Tibetans, to us, research or the issue that you are going to raise is not only part of our subject matter, but we are ourselves in some way, sense, subjects of the topic. So Sophie would like you to begin.
Sure, thank you so much, Bhutanla, and to all of our friends at ICT. I think there are some organizations that we feel we have a very special connection to, and ICT is close to the top of that list. I'm also very eager to not talk too much myself because I'm very keen to know what Rinzin and Tashi think. But I also want to note that in preparation for this talk this afternoon, I actually went back through all of the reports that we've published on Tibet since I've been at Human Rights Watch. And I want to thank the hundreds and hundreds of Tibetans who gave us the confidence or had confidence in us to share their stories with us, because I think when you talk about the importance of human rights research and advocacy, it's not just the hard facts, I think, that you need to make a compelling case. It's that you need human stories. We need people to tell us what's happened to them and to understand, what they've experienced and what they tried to do about it and whether anyone tried to help them. To be able to put those experiences into their proper context. And so I want very much to acknowledge the incredible role that those people have played over the years. I doubt any of them are on this call now, but we think about those people very much, and in fact feel like that's who we work for. But maybe just a quick explanation of sort of perfect world Human Rights Watch research and reporting. In a perfect world, we have the ability to spot a particular kind of human rights violation that's either new or that's somehow different or unique, that we think hasn't gotten enough attention, and about which we think we can make some useful recommendations to people who will actually make change as a result of that. And again, in an ideal world, we can interview people freely without having to worry about their safety or about our researchers. We have access to the policymakers who, at least in theory, were responsible for protecting them and maybe failed. In the best case scenario, we also have lots of access to policy documents. We can submit requests for records. We can go to the places where abuses took place. In the best case scenario, we can even interview the people who themselves committed the abuses to ask them why they did it. I think it's fair to say that over the time that I've been at Human Rights Watch since 2006, that's never been the operating reality for work on Tibet, on China, on Xinjiang, and in fact, even on some China-related issues outside of the mainland. I think it has become exponentially more difficult, even just over the last 10 years, to do good work on and in Tibet. When I started with Human Rights Watch, there were still, a fairly steady stream of people who would come out of the country and to whom we would have access primarily in Kathmandu, and who could tell us their stories. And I think, as a methodological matter, we always knew that those people were, a somewhat self-selecting group, that the information they had wasn't necessarily representative, but it was how we found out about issues like the forced relocation of nomads, for example. And in fact, even some of our earliest information from the report we just published about threats to mother tongue education came from some of those early interviews in sort of roughly 2008, 2009. But over the last decade, we've watched it become much more difficult for people to get outside of the country. It's much riskier for people to talk to us, or really to anyone, through electronic means, which is a strategy we've employed reasonably successfully for other parts of the country, meaning we'll talk to people on the phone or over secure encrypted platforms. That's become much more challenging. it's even become more difficult, we find, to do interviews in places like Kathmandu, because the level of surveillance of people there is so high. And we do try very hard, constantly. That's probably sort of the most futile feeling part of our work. We try constantly to write to different parts of the Chinese government or engage it to get its responses on specific issues. It never responds, which is frustrating because we want to be able to at least have a fresh perspective from sort of that side of their side of an issue to understand why they're doing what they're doing. I think one of the other real challenges is that other strategies that I think we in ICT and others have relied on, trying, for example, to cull information from social media, has become more difficult as those channels have gotten much more heavily censored over the years. We have done whole projects that were largely based on existing available data sets. A real hat tip here to the CECC and the inimitable Steve Marshall for all of his work over the years, which really, in some cases, served as the basis for reports that we could produce about the trends around cracking down on social organizations, or really what the trends of detention, what people were getting detained for, what charges they were given, the length of sentences. And so, as you're sort of running out of those standard sources of information, or they're getting hard to get at, we've had to be somewhat entrepreneurial about going out and finding facts. It's also, I think, very challenging for our researchers that they can't really plan the way others in the organization do. We look with envy at our colleagues who work on the U.S. or other open societies, and who can say, well, this year I'm going to write 3 reports about A, B, and C. We really have to wait and see what kind of information comes to us and how to sort of piece together these shards of information to paint a bigger picture, and then assess, does this constitute a human rights violation? What sort of violation is it? Do we have enough information to make the case for a particular kind of change? We try very hard to keep the scope of our claims closely tied to the volume and the strengths of the facts that we have at hand. And so just a quick word about the report we published recently on access to mother tongue education for Tibetans. That really was the product of years and years of work of slowly gathering, 1 or 2 interviews here, lots of policy documents there, some reports from state media, descriptions of policy changes from Chinese Ministry of Education experts. It's a little bit more like painting an elaborate portrait than doing a sort of quick report about, an attack on protesters, for example, in some part of the world. It really, really takes time to be able to put these things together. And then when we publish, it's tough, partly because, we can't really have any way of knowing whether our findings are reaching the people that we've written about, which in a way matters most to us. We want people to know that we're sort of recognizing what they're experiencing and trying to draw attention to it. It's also difficult because the authorities who are primarily responsible for these problems are really, in many respects, beyond our reach. We try often and hard to make sure that, embassies, for example, at least receive copies of what we've written. They've gotten back into the habit in the last couple of years of sending those back to us unopened. And then accuse us of not being objective when they won't even have a conversation about the issues that we're trying to raise. We're certainly very grateful for example, RFA and VOA and their work amplifying, what we've been able to write about, and particularly that they can do it in Tibetan, which I think is particularly important. But maybe I'll just wrap up there by saying that I worry longer term about our ability to do good research as the Chinese government seems to be systematically cutting off all of these avenues or kinds of access to information. And what happens when literally people can't get out of the country anymore, and when it's become considerably more difficult for anybody to post anything on social media, and effectively when communications with people outside the country have become the targets of criminal investigations. I think that's an environment in which it becomes almost impossible to do good work. But on some level, I take a little bit of comfort from our colleagues who work on North Korea, who do still manage to produce good reporting, at a very different pace from other parts of the organization. But I think we all know that the more the Chinese government tries to pull up the drawbridge and keep us from seeing what's going on inside Tibet, the more important it is to keep trying. There are serious human rights violations taking place. It is absolutely our mandate and our commitment to documenting that however we can, and we're going to keep trying. I'm also very open to any clever suggestions that people who are on the call today may have. We have gotten great ideas in the past from people outside the organization, and we really welcome those. So I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. I think what you say about challenges to research is very much evidenced as we speak by the latest State Department Religious Freedom Report that they released yesterday. It's very clear from reading the Tibet section, for example, the problems even the federal government has in trying to get information about situation in Tibet, or for that matter, China also. Anyway, before I bring in my colleagues, just a brief question to you. What brought you to Tibet in a way? Because I recall you saying something about Oberlin and a visit by a Tibetan official there.
When I was a senior at Oberlin, I had the choice to do either an honors thesis or to do a winter term. We had a 1-month winter term to design a particular project then. And I was already more of an activist than an academic. And so, and I was very outraged. This was, I think, before SFT was even founded, but I was outraged that there was nothing in the curriculum at Oberlin that focused on Tibet. And so I asked for permission to design a short winter term course for students about Tibet. And that was when, I'm going to lose it a little bit, Lodi La came.
So Lodi Gary.
Lodi Gary came. It was the first time I met him. I was 21, which was not yesterday. We had several speakers come to campus to talk about politics and religion and traditional storytelling and anthropology. And it was, I think, for me, it was a transformative event or opportunity in that, it's amazing if you ask people if they'll do something, they'll say yes. And if you go out and do the work of putting it together, you can make some change and help people learn about things and have them carry that experience forward. And I fell hard and never looked back.
Thank you so much. And now I bring in my colleagues, Rinzin Sonom and Tashi Chogyal. Rinzin, both of them are alumni of Tibetan Youth Leadership Program, which is one of ICT's Tibetan empowerment programs. I think Rinzin did that in 2017. Tashi Chogyal did that in 2006, I think so. Yeah. So Rinzin, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Sophie, for sharing that. That was really moving. Hi. So I wanted to introduce myself, a little bit about myself, like Pujingla already did, and then I have a question for you. As Pujingla said, I was actually born in Tibet in Uzang, Tungvi. And then I later moved to Nepal, then to India, where I studied in the TCV boarding school of Gopalpur. And then I was lucky enough to go to private school in the United States and study about whatever I wanted. And I chose to do my senior year thesis on the education in Tibet and the access, and was it private, public? And I tried to figure out all of these research, but it was really, really difficult. It was he says, this says, and I had to constantly make sure the sources are credible. It was very difficult. That was, the whole thing. And my question to you is, in your experience, how do you bridge the gap between your research and the users, and especially to Tibetans?
Wow, that's a great and tough question. I mean, I like to think, I hope, that the topics that we're choosing to focus on really have been not chosen for us, but rather that the people we interact with help point us in that direction. Often Human Rights Watch work isn't just a product of a researcher sitting in an office in New York or, in some other part of the world saying, I want to work on that. It's that we're hearing from communities we know. It's that we're hearing from other activists or media, or just ordinary people in a community saying, I'm worried about this. At which point, we'll start exploring an issue a little bit more to see, what's actually happening. Is it a human rights violation? Can we make, something useful out of it? And I think part of what really motivated us to do this project about access to mother tongue education, which I have to tell you made our lawyers a little bit crazy, because it's while there is a right to mother tongue education, there's nothing that says how much or in what format or and so we have to assess what we think is guaranteed to an individual under international law. Fortunately, I have fantastic colleagues who work on children's rights and education worldwide who could help us sort of shape what our view as an organization should be on that issue. And I'm really pleased that there are now 2 other projects on other parts of the world going about mother tongue education. But part of what really drove us to work on that was because we just kept hearing from people in the community all across the world that this really mattered to them, that having the opportunity for their children to be educated in Tibetan, they saw as clearly being quite central to their identity as Tibetans. Many people didn't object to the idea of also learning Chinese, but it was clear that, for them, the loss of that opportunity, the loss of, fluency in Tibetan was a loss of identity. And I think that really motivated us to work even more on this topic. And, we've had different feedback, I think, as a result of that to this project than to ones that we've done on other issues. But there's also just the challenge that, we can't know how many people inside Tibet even know that we work on these, let alone that we've written about nomads or protests or these other kinds of issues. But I think it matters a lot to us to try to really ground the work in what people in the community themselves are concerned about.
Vincent, you have another question?
Yes, I do. Sophie, my other question is, in the United States, there's obviously a huge systematic racism problem. And in Tibet, that's also an issue, along with cultural genocide. So my question to you is, when you do this research, what is your methodology in focusing on topics, and how do you go about that? Because there's so much. Anything can relate to systematic racism and cultural cleansing, but what do you focus on, and what is your kind of process and methodology about that?
Yeah, I think certainly the world is showing us quite blatantly just how much systematic racism there is, near and far. I think with respect to our work on Tibet, we're often motivated, not just in China but in other places in the world, in really challenging governments' claims that they're complying with all of their obligations under human rights. And the Chinese government loves to say that it has a great track record, especially with respect to discrimination, to which we say, not so fast, folks. And so a lot of what we've done over the years is to show not just the discriminatory effects of policies, for example, against a particular religious community, such as Tibetan Buddhists, or to show the discrimination against a particular community through economic means, like a lot of the policies about forcibly resettling nomads, which has had terrible consequences for them, in terms of their standard of living. There's a whole slew of rights implicated in denying people the ability to sustain themselves in the way that they've done for centuries. But I think it's also not hard to show, racism in Chinese government documents in Tibetan areas or in Uyghur areas, where clearly the people who are of those areas are treated as lesser. And it's whether that's sort of a tokenistic approach, or we're seeing another wave of these inducements across Uyghur areas for ethnic intermarriage, where people are given economic benefits if a Uyghur and a non-Uyghur marry, which of course is discriminatory against other permutations of couples. The Chinese government doesn't like to be accused of being racist. Too bad it is. The policy documents are there to show it. And I think it really is about challenging that claim to comply with domestic and international standards. And for whatever people may think about the UN human rights system, I continue to point out that it is extraordinary what an effect a single member of the Committee on Against Discrimination's comments about China had in massively elevating the issues around human rights violations against Uyghurs. One query from one member of one committee wound up being on the front page of newspapers worldwide, and I think that's that alone is a compelling reason to keep documenting systematic racism and discrimination, because Beijing gets called out for it.
Yeah, before I bring in Tashil, you mentioned about methodology and coverage, and I think many of us are those who work in Tibet are always sort of puzzled. Why does it take, even if you have information, for example, the Tibetan self-immolation, we have had 150 plus people who died. But even though we do have maybe not enough information, but we do have quite a bit of information on all of these cases, why has there not been that much of attention to these? Then, say, for example, what you mentioned just now on other issues?
I think humans have short attention spans. And we deal with a media environment that encourages ever shorter ones and doesn't encourage expertise. I think these are massive generalizations, so people are welcome to challenge me or make fun of me. But I think we've gotten accustomed to very kind of almost Twitter level analysis of just about anything, that doesn't leave a lot of room or encourage people to stop and really educate themselves about recent history or about policies. And then that effect is that if something can't be reduced to a headline, it can be very hard to generate attention. But and I think also people in different parts of the world are just completely interested in or uninterested in very different things, and we spend a lot of time within Human Rights Watch trying to figure out which audiences could be, might be more interested in, particular topics. And even as we've experimented over the last several years, publishing more in Chinese and tracking more carefully which Chinese-speaking audiences are interested in what, some of those results can be quite counterintuitive. But, I think we live very much in a world of, the CNN crawl going by and, not being sort of pushed or expected to understand more than that. But, I think I'll say this, that some of our researchers, I think, find it incredibly frustrating that they really dive down very deep into a particular issue or a community or a history, and then the last bit of any project is to write the press release for a report and then some tweets, and I think people find it very difficult to take all of this work they've done and then just reduce it down into a single little soundbite. I think on some level, intellectually, they kind of resent that.
Thank you. Tasha.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks, Sophie, for being here, and thanks, Buchanwal, for the introduction. Just to add on shortly as well on my end, I'm a Tibetan American from Vancouver, Washington. So born and raised and educated on the West Coast. And currently, as Buchanwal said, also a graduate student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, focusing on international negotiation and security studies. I'm sure there's many folks on this call who went virtual this semester due to COVID. I'm one of them as well, fulfilling every Tibetan parent's dream of moving back home and continuing your education. So again, shout out to folks who have adapted to that and will continue to adapt to that for the coming year. So again, my experience in the federal government has been more on the legal side and on the development side, and I hope to return into the public service after finishing my education. So my first question, kind of around U.S. foreign policy, specifically, we've seen during the Obama administration a pivot to Asia, and now a lot of these documents about the Indo-Pacific as its own geostrategic region, of how the U.S. government is approaching it. And my questions regarding how Tibet and human rights issues in Tibet, but also in the region, have been affecting, or how it affects U.S. strategy in the region. And the second part of the question is about, ideally, how would human rights, issues in Tibet should be integrated into U.S. strategy in the region?
Frantically scribbling that down. Second. Well, those are two massive
easy
questions.
for
I'll do
you.
my best.
Yeah.
I'm having a bad flashback to my dissertation defense here. On the first question about U.S. foreign policy and where Tibetan human rights fit in, my short assessment of the Obama administration is that they took these issues seriously. They, I think, were well informed and sought out information. I don't think they did much. The Trump administration talks a lot, talks big, talks tough, talks a fair amount about Tibet and about religious freedom. I think their motivations are not where they ought to be. And frankly, I don't think you're a terribly credible interlocutor on human rights issues when you're putting kids in cages. I would commend everyone to all of Human Rights Watch's work, on the U.S. both during the Trump and the Obama administrations. I certainly don't see the Trump administration pushing forward any new or clever or innovative solutions for Tibetans, particularly. But I think we should give, a nod to the many members of Congress who I think are extremely engaged on these issues and who have proposed, creative new legislation that addresses everything from, ensuring that the reincarnation process stays firmly in the control of Tibetan Buddhists and not the Chinese government, but all the way through to looking at, the conduct of Chinese companies both across China and outside the country. There's been a lot of Congress seems to have really sort of re-engaged on its foreign policy mantle in these last couple of years, which is good and productive, I think. Maybe I can try to answer the question also in my perfect world scenario, which is that, first of all, it's an administration, that takes human rights seriously at home and abroad, and in that latter part by making it a fundamental pillar of foreign policy. And that it not just be siloed off in a little box that's always the last point in, the summit communique or a press release about a visit, that, it's central to decisions about climate change, about, economic development, about a host of different issues, but also that really puts the rights of affected communities at the center of the discussions. Whether that administration ever gets elected remains to be seen. Maybe I'll try running someday. I think that would never work. But it's also interesting to think about Tibet as a regional issue and how the U.S. engages, not just Beijing on these topics, but also, Delhi and Kathmandu, and on issues like climate change and water supply. For example, we've seen another skirmish recently between China and India along the border. As far as I can tell, the U.S. was reasonably AWOL from that discussion, but and I think it's generally AWOL from the engaging on this issue regionally across the board. Just to give you one example where I think the U.S. and like-minded governments really need to be engaging right now, not just with sort of traditional partners like the UK or Australia, but with Delhi and Kathmandu. Is to talk about what happens around the succession issue and making sure that they are all on the same page and that, they sort of gained out different scenarios in advance so that when the moment comes, when invariably Beijing says, here's the new incarnation, everybody else can speak with one voice forcibly to say, no, we're on this other track and this is the acceptable candidate chosen by the community, and here are the consequences for you, Beijing, of trying to manipulate that process. But I don't see the U.S. really or others going out and doing that work.
Tasha, your next question.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Shifting gears a little bit, for maybe there are folks on the call who are young high schoolers or college students or maybe some grad students as well, who want a career in this line of work. Maybe it was the Tibet issue that introduced them to human rights issues, or kind of a bigger kind of universe of issues going on, and maybe they do want to pursue this as a career for further studies after they graduate or going forward. What advice, or I guess kind of what was the thing I wish I knew back when, for folks who do want to go in that direction, either on Tibet or just kind of human rights issues going forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, y'all come on, as we'd say here. I think, if there's, I should say that some of the youth activism that's been on display recently, I find breathtaking, and that's everything from around the protests, against Mr. Floyd's murder to things like the Sunrise Movement, or just the extent of activism about things like climate change. It's really remarkable. Broadly speaking, find an issue that you really care about. Make sure you're reading as much about or by the people who take a diametrically opposed view, so that you know sort of what you're arguing for and against. Know what you want. Know who can make that change. Go find them, persuade them. There are lots of different forms of advocacy out there, but I think often the best is done by people who really are somehow personally vested in that particular issue. I'll answer this question now, partly because, it comes up a lot, but, when Human Rights Watch is hiring, entry-level or junior-level people or researchers, often what we're looking for is that kind of commitment, a certain amount of experience and expertise, for sure, on a particular issue in a particular country. We want people who've got good research and writing skills. We want people who've got good language skills. But the thing I look for the most, I couldn't care less where people went to school. I couldn't care less, if you've interned with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, that's nice to see. But what I'm really looking for is evidence of that, that passion and that zeal to go out and try to make change, and some indication, that people have acted on that. That they really are committed to making change. Those to me are sort of some of the key elements broadly, but also with respect to what we tend to look for.
Thank you, Sophie. Now, next we'll see if there are questions from the people. Before I do that, one sort of a follow-up question to what Tashi mentioned about Indo-Pacific strategy. As from a research perspective, what advantage can we from the Tibet movement take of this fact that this administration, for example, is stressing on the Indo-Pacific region? There is, in the Congress, there's a legislation, ARIA, which is again dedicated to the Indo-Pacific region, and Tibet and Tibet's water, if water rights are human rights. They are a major cause of concern for the people in South and Southeast Asia. So from research perspective, what can we do?
Well, I think, first of all, documenting what's going wrong, and what both, the human and the human rights consequences of that are. Although, for all the people who are on the call who are environmental experts or who are sociologists, you don't have to have the human rights law dimension to it. I think documenting the harms, from whatever your perspective is key, and lining that up against what the international or even what the domestic legal obligations are. But I think it's also about making policy recommendations, that produce change, then getting out and taking them to the governments or the politicians who are in a position to do that. I mean, I sort of cock an eyebrow a little bit at the Indo-Pacific strategy, because I'm not really sure what in the real world that actually means, or what people are doing or trying to achieve. It seems a bit like the pivot. It's kind of a catchy little slogan, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of organization or diplomacy or clearly agreed upon objectives that are being pursued in a systematic way. And I think over the past year, so much has gotten subsumed in, the deteriorating relationship between Washington and Beijing. And I think some of those, some of the other governments that are part of the Indo-Pacific strategy feel like they're at best sort of second-order players on the sidelines of this much larger dispute, and that, in a way, the sort of first and only question they're getting asked is, are you on the U.S.'s side or China's? Which historically is exactly where those countries never wanted to be, right? I mean, they've got to deal with both. So I guess I just don't see it as being even really an effective or consequential organizing strategy for foreign policy, and it's more sort of, branding, as they say these days.
Thank you, Sophie. And now over to Ashwin.
So we do have a few questions here from our audience. And actually our first question, it comes from a person named Kathy Ashton, who is writing to us from Rochester, Minnesota. So thank you, Kathy, for writing in and for watching the Tibet Talks. And this question actually came in yesterday, so we got this well in advance. The question is, can you talk about what is happening with communication with those inside Tibet? Sophie, I know you touched on that a little bit, but if you could just elaborate on that question, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, maybe the best way to answer that is to say a little bit about how we have recently tried to communicate with some people, which really involves putting as many degrees of separation between us and the person to whom we are asking questions as possible. Which presents all sorts of challenges in sort of maintaining substantive integrity. I mean, imagine a massive, stressful, multilingual game of telephone, when the person at the farthest end is being asked questions on issues that are, potentially traumatic or scary or put them at risk. We spend a lot of time training researchers to handle interviews in a very sensitive fashion, both to not re-traumatize people, to not put them at risk, to ensure that they understand what's going to happen with the information they're providing, and that they give full consent. All of these issues, as methodological and ethical issues, get that much more complicated the more people who are involved in the chain of trying to simply carry out interviews. There's a tiny handful of people we have miraculously managed to keep in touch with over the years, who are sprinkled across very different areas, who we go back to very carefully occasionally, just to get their perspective on what's happening in their region. One of those people was quite communicative up until about a year ago. We have no idea why he stopped communicating. I think about this about once a week and start to hyperventilate because, it's entirely possible this person could have been detained simply for talking to one of our folks. So we have to try to be as careful as we possibly can about that. But I'm constantly amazed at the extent, with the efforts that some people will make to get information to us, again, often through multiple different chains or multiple different people who know ultimately to bring information to us. But it's a real challenge, and we can't. At this point, I'm not even sure we can keep releasing reports as we have for years in Hong Kong. There are just enormous difficulties in getting the information we've gathered and assessed back to people in the community, and that's challenging, because we want to make sure that we're writing about useful things to people in that community and that they can see the results of their having shared their stories with us.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, that's great. We actually have several more questions coming in here. First, we have one from Bim Suba, and this also deals a little bit with an issue that you spoke about. And this is for Sophie and also for the other panelists, if anybody wants to weigh in on this after her. How do you see India-China interactions vis-a-vis Tibet and Tibetans? And as you mentioned, this is an issue that's been in the news lately. So if there's anything else you'd like to say about that.
This is a historically very fraught relationship. going back to, well, I mean, going back hundreds of years, but particularly to, the 50s and the 60s, with, generally China aligning with Pakistan against India on various issues. We've written, I'm duty bound to point out that we have written quite a bit about serious human rights violations by the Modi government. And again, I would commend you to my colleagues' work on that. But, it's interesting to me that I think it was when Modi was first elected that the Sikyong was invited to the inauguration. Bhutan is nodding, so yes, I'm correct. Good, thank you. Was that more than just a poke in China's eye? Was that a serious commitment or a gesture on India's part to say, this is an important issue to us? I don't think so. I mean, often when we go to the Indian government and ask it to take more, assertive steps regarding Tibetans, they will say, listen, we've given this community sanctuary for decades. We're not going to do anything more than that. We've got other fish to fry, especially with Beijing, and we're not looking to upset the apple cart. So that's sort of been my experience as an advocate meeting with Indian officials. But I'm sure that Tashi and Minzin are better informed than I am.
Yeah, I'll take that one. I think it's very important just to look at the Tibet issue and that issue from a security lens, quite frankly, from both India and China. I mean, you've got the border areas, as Sophie mentioned earlier. We saw the dust up just a few weeks ago in the Ladakh Kashmir area, the northwest border issue, the Arunachal Pradesh area, that was an issue. I'd say for folks looking to learn more about it, I'd say really look at the history, since 49, since 47, since the start of the PRC in India, to see how the Tibet, just as a geostrategic region, has just been such a contentious area between both countries, and to dive more into it. But completely agree with Sophie's assessment on how the different countries are approaching it.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, guys. So another question here on Facebook from Pema Tenzing Tibet Song. And the question is, this is for Sophie, is a third-party monitor of the Panchen Lama and where the Panchen Lama is that possible or not, to have a third-party monitor, observing where the Panchen Lama is and his status?
Let me just make sure that I understand the question correctly. I assume the person is asking about the genuine Panchen Lama, not the appointment.
Yeah, I believe so. It's not clear in the question, but I'm pretty certain that's who they're referring to.
Well, in principle, yes. In reality, I think that would be virtually impossible to persuade the Chinese government to allow, because among other things, it would, at least on some level, require acknowledging that he has not been free, or that he is constrained in a way that merits that kind of observation or monitoring. And I struggle to imagine Beijing consenting to that. That said, it's certainly an interesting idea, and we're at a bit of a moment now when there's actually a certain amount of pressure on Beijing not only to allow in independent international investigators to look at the situation in Xinjiang, which of course it has, Beijing has mightily worked to reject, but it's also under pressure to allow investigations into the origins of COVID. Recently there are demands for a special envoy on Hong Kong following the decision by the National People's Congress to impose national security legislation on Hong Kong. So there's greater momentum than any moment I can think of in recent years for some kind of external observation or some kind of fact-finding missions or investigators to perform these functions, partly because I think not a lot of people believe Beijing's view that for example, all is fine in Xinjiang, or that the Panchen Lama is fine and just wants to be left alone.
Thank you for that. That is a very positive note, so I'm glad that you could share that.
That's a great idea.
And we have another question here also from Facebook, and it's from Pema Seldon. And this can be a question for all the panelists. Sophie, if you want to start. Do you think a quiet, behind-the-scenes push for human rights works better with China than being vocal in international fora? So is it better to work behind the scenes with China, or is it better to bring this up in international fora?
I can answer this very expeditiously. No. I mean, for 20 years, this is what governments said they were doing. And, maybe they were just lying to all of us and they weren't actually doing it at all. But for 20 years, lots of governments said, no, we can't do these things publicly. We shouldn't criticize them. It'll back them into a corner. It'll make them lose face, a phrase I hate. Nobody likes to be embarrassed. Chinese Communist Party doesn't have a lock on that idea. And look where we are. That's been the strategy, and it has failed spectacularly. Look, 90% of diplomacy that goes on every day is by definition behind closed doors, but that's clearly the way Beijing wants it, so that it then doesn't really have to be held accountable for anything. And the fact that it hasn't been underpinned by, more public pushes to hold them accountable, I think has been problematic. But Vincent, Tashi, what do you guys think?
I have to agree with you, Sophie. I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I think doing media and activism outside and making people aware of what's going on can have a bigger impact than doing behind closed doors. But again, I'm not an expert in this, but I totally agree with you, Sophie.
Just to add a point as well. I know Sophie and I talked about it on our pre-call as well, but I think a lot of countries will still look to the United States to kind of call the ball or lead the charge. And I think that we do need, of course, the behind the scenes and the public engagement. And I also think that the United States in particular leading on that engagement can provide leadership for other countries to join in, but also provides cover for other countries. It's like, well, the U.S. has already made these statements, so of course we're going to kind of join the bandwagon and jump on. So I think, again, U.S. leadership is key on this issue.
Wonderful. And we're almost about out of time, but if I could ask maybe just one quick follow-up here. So, Sophie, you mentioned that it has been the policy for at least the last 25 years, if not much longer than that, to try to integrate China into the global order. And the hope was that by doing so, they would adopt democratic norms and human rights norms. And clearly now looking back on it, that's been a failure. That just has not worked. And in fact, if anything, there's kind of been the opposite situation where China is imposing its system on other countries. At the same time, it seems like more people are recognizing that approach has failed, and there's more of a kind of open acknowledgement of that. Are you optimistic now as we're looking forward that there can be a different and more intelligent approach to China moving forward?
Ashton, this is literally what I lie awake at night and worry about because, look, the fact that the Chinese government operates now with such a sense of impunity, an expectation of impunity that it will not be held accountable is frightening, I think. And it's not an accident that the Chinese government has invested significantly in weakening the UN human rights ecosystem, which is precisely the system that could hold it accountable for example, gross human rights violations of, an order of magnitude against Uyghurs or Tibetans that if committed by just about any other government, we would already see accountability proceedings, right? It's not just that China is trying to block off means of holding it accountable, as you said a minute ago. It's now increasingly trying to write the rules and rewrite the norms itself. One of the first things we're going to see when the UN Human Rights Council goes back into session next week is the Chinese government put forward its so-called mutually beneficial cooperation resolution, which really is another step on the road towards gutting that institution of the idea that states should be held accountable for serious human rights violations and that independent civil society organizations have to be part of these conversations. And if that resolution gets a lot of support and isn't challenged, that just further emboldens the Chinese government to try to rewrite the rules. And I don't know about everybody on this call, but I'm reasonably confident that that is not the international order that we all want to live in. But the kind of effort it is going to take to mobilize rights-respecting governments to, form a coalition to be a serious counterweight to Beijing and map out a multi-year strategy, to protect that system and strengthen it while also dealing on a bilateral basis with human rights issues is an enormous challenge. We've got a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Sophie. We're just about out of time, but I do want to give an opportunity, Tashila and Rinzanla, if you have any final comments or any additions you'd like to make to Sophie's answer, we'll do that and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, Sophie, I just wanted to thank you for being here and for ICT for hosting this. But there's obviously so many questions we still have, right? But there's very limited time. But all the questions we asked, you answered perfectly. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me. Happy to keep talking too, anytime.
Yeah, thank you, ICT, Ashwin, and of course Sophie for joining us today. I just make two quick plugs for folks that are watching to go. Please read some of Sophie's reports online. You can find them online easily. She's done a lot of great work, and really has her finger on the pulse of what's going on in Tibet and human rights issues in the region. And secondly, again, for folks who are kind of in school right now, kind of towards the TYLP crowd, I encourage you to look into roles and career paths that Sophie mentioned on the advocacy side, but also not to rule out roles in public service. I think with the leadership we've seen going on right now, and especially at the local and state level, I think it's key to not only vote, but make sure that Tibetan Americans, Tibetan immigrants, engage in the system that we are currently living in and educated in, to be an advocate for Tibetans and for the Asian American community as a whole.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Tasha. I think that's a perfect note to end on. And I'd just like to thank you, thank Rinzanla, thank Sophie, and thank Buchung for moderating. And thank you guys for this excellent conversation. And as we close up here, we did actually get a response from Bim Suba, whose question you guys answered earlier. And he said, impressive talk, and thank you to all the panelists for taking the question. Look forward to more such talks in the future. And Bim mentions that he's from Hyderabad in India. So thank you to Bim, and thank you to all of you who are watching. We know that this is a difficult time for our entire world, but we hope that this conversation encouraged you to take positive action for Tibet. We know that together we can make a difference for the Tibetan people. So thank you all for watching. We will be back next week with another episode of Tibet Talks, and we hope to see you then. Until then, to paraphrase Professor Tenzin Dorji, our first ever guest on Tibet Talks, stay safe, stay well, and stay active. Thank you, and Tukchiche.